Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I'd like to talk to you about the basic principles of chemistry. And so you might be wondering, I thought this is a biology class, but of course it is, but biology is really a branch of science that deals with the manifestation of life through the chemical interactions of non-living molecules. And so what's fascinating is that we need to explore some of these fundamental concepts of chemistry, so, if you will, some of the basic principles of inorganic chemistry, such as, what are elements, what are atoms, those kinds of things, in order to sort of step it up to larger molecules so that we can understand how cells ultimately are functioning, and then living organisms even beyond that are multicellular. So let's jump into this conversation. I think you're going to like it. It's the type of thing, I call this biochemistry, but really it's the introduction to chemistry because, as you might notice from this diagram right here, this is a sort of a small view of DNA. And DNA is composed of, billions of atoms. And so not only are nucleic acids important, but carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. And so all these things are composed of elements. And so basic chemistry, it's intrinsic upon us to understand the chemical context of life. And so all of these principles in chemistry are going to help us out in biology. And so I want to emphasize that by looking at this hierarchy right here. So ultimately, if you're studying things like ecology and populations of zebra, how many are there, if they're declining or they're increasing, sort of the demographics of the population. You could even be studying community. You could be looking at how predators interact with zebra, or the whole ecosystem, or the biome of the savanna. Or you could take it down and say, well, the organism, a single organism, the zebra, you can say is composed of many systems. There's the circulatory system, the urinary system, the reproductive system of the zebra. And so those were the things that is traditionally studied in physiology. In other words, the function of organs. And then speaking of organs, if you have a collection of organs, it makes up a system. So the heart and the blood vessels make up the cardiovascular system. But the heart itself, being an organ, is comprised of different tissue types. Not only is it cardiac muscle, but there's also some adipose tissue and some nerve tissue. And then ultimately, muscle tissue is comprised of muscle cells. And so cell is the smallest unit of life. And so groups of similar cells that function together is a tissue. So we have four tissues. We have epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissue. So this is an example of muscle tissue. It's rather long and cylinder like this. Here's the nucleus, and you might know this again from your background in biology, but inside the nucleus is a very important molecule called deoxyribonucleic acid, and this is where the chemistry comes in. In order to understand the functionality of muscle contraction, you're like, well, isn't muscle contraction having to do with proteins sliding next to each other, the sliding filament theory of actin and myosin? Well, ultimately, those proteins, actin and myosin, are produced on ribosomes, which are little organelles within the cell. And those organelles, like for example ribosomes in the nucleus, work together to produce proteins. And so ultimately, to understand protein synthesis, in other words, the polymerization of amino acids into polypeptides, you have to understand transcription, the making of RNA, and then ultimately translation, the formation of the peptide bond in the cytoplasm. And so it's a lot of chemistry in biology. So I hope I've convinced you of that. And so we're going to take a journey on the most fundamental level. And so we start off with, the basic principles of chemistry, which is chemistry is the study of matter. Matter is anything that has mass and takes up space. You might be familiar with that. And so matter is composed of these chemical elements that we found not only on the Earth, but we can find in space as well, and other planets that we've visited, like for example the Moon and Mars. And so what are these elements? Elements are pure. They cannot be broken down into other chemical elements. And so what's interesting about these elements is that there's about 92 approximately naturally occurring elements. There's more of them that we can generate ourselves, we can synthesize. And so how do we symbolize these elements? We could use either English or Latin or German. We usually use capital letters. And if there's two letters, we use a capital and a lowercase. You might be familiar with that with the periodic table of elements. And so what's fascinating about chemistry, there's so many things, is that the elements don't often roam by themselves. They usually form friends and allies, and they get together in what we call either molecules or compounds. Compound would be two different elements getting together in a particular ratio. Like a classic example of a compound would be salt or sodium chloride. And here's a picture of the element sodium, and here is the element chlorine. And when these two things bond with one another, it forms sodium chloride, which is table salt. I find that interesting because sodium's a metal and chlorine's a gas, but when you combine them together in a chemical bond, an emerging property comes into it. So salt is neither of these two. And so that's what's kind of neat. You can take things like carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen and put them together, and you can form like a fat, or you can form a sugar. It all depends on the chemical bonding and the ratio of elements. It's rather curious. It's just like anything. Like if you've had an opportunity to build things with little plastic models or Legos or Tinker toys, these kinds of things, you could use the same pieces and create all different structures, all different things. So when it relates to biology, I mentioned 92 elements. Only about 25 of them are found in living organisms. And so approximately 25% of the chemical elements are found in life. And of those 25, 4 of them really dominate. So it's carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen make up 96% of all living things. So it doesn't matter if you're a giant blue whale or a huge sequoia tree or a teeny tiny ant. You have 96% of your elements are these right in here: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Of course, you have more if you're a whale, but these ratios are consistent. So the remaining, if you wanted to throw this in, phosphorus is a really important one, and then, of course, calcium, sulfur, and potassium. And then there's some trace elements that are really important as well. I always like to invoke this. This is something that I learned when I was studying biochemistry once upon a time, but this sort of acronym called CHOMPS, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, really make up a big component. And if you want to throw in calcium and potassium, go right ahead. And so here's an example of a trace element that we don't do very well without, which is iron. It's a metal, and Fe is found in a protein that's very, very common in the body called hemoglobin. We have approximately 300 million molecules of hemoglobin per red blood cell. It's hard to imagine. It's almost the population of the United States of hemoglobin in one red cell, and there's probably several billion red blood cells in the body at any given time. So there's a lot of need for iron. Where do we get it? We get it from our diet. So we eat iron. We need to eat it. It's essential. But even though there's so much hemoglobin, iron is needed in a small, minute quantity relative to things that we eat large, like carbon and oxygen and hydrogen, these kinds of things, and nitrogen. So do you see this kind of shiny looking silver-like thing? This is called a heme group, and so it's a non-protein. This orange and red is the protein. There's actually 4 polypeptide chains. This is the quaternary structure. And so there's actually 4 elements of iron that are found. And this whole structure is a heme. And what its function is that it holds on to oxygen. And so hemoglobin helps to carry oxygen. And so red blood cells transport oxygen in the body. Without it, we'd be not doing too well. Here's a great example of a trace element, iodine. It turns out that we have a gland in our neck that's usually not this swollen, called the thyroid. And it's like this woman is struggling from a disorder called goiter. And the reason that it's swollen like this is because she's lacking iodine. And so the thyroid gland isn't able to make two hormones properly because the hormones contain iodine. So as a result, her brain is producing a hormone causing her thyroid to increase in size to sort of step it up, but she can't do it. And so how do you solve this? You just simply supplement her diet with iodine. And so often in the United States, we do this by mixing sodium chloride, which is table salt, and we throw in another salt, potassium iodide. And so those two salts combine to make what we think is iodized salt, which it is. And you only need a little bit. And so that's kind of interesting. So we need iron, we need magnesium. I can go off on all of these elements, but I won't. But magnesium is a pretty important one. There's enzymes in the body that require magnesium to function properly. One of them is DNA polymerase. It's pretty crucial. So getting to the basics, and again, you might have background in this, and it's perfectly fine. But you might know that an element, like for example, if you have a big block of iron, it's made up of iron atoms. Or if you have some gold, it's made up of gold atoms. All the atoms are different than one another. And they differ because an atom itself is made up of three subatomic particles: protons, neutrons, and electrons. It's a little funny about the story of an atom. I won't go too far with it, but when the Greeks started to philosophize about atoms, the Greek word for indivisible is atomos, which is kind of interesting because the atom is divisible into three subatomic particles. And even these subatomic particles can be broken down into smaller quarks, and then ultimately a string theory. And so it's a classic example. The atomic theory we're always learning new things about it. It's kind of cool that all matter is made up of these particles. And so what's interesting is the neutrons are neutral in terms of physical properties. Protons are positive, electrons are negative. And the neutrons and protons are packed together in the central core of the atom called the nucleus. And the electrons move around very quickly at the speed of light, forming a cloud around the nucleus. More about that later. So you can see here's the protons and neutrons. Now, to determine what's the difference between one element and another, what's the difference if you go on the periodic table, what's the difference between hydrogen and helium and lithium and boron and carbon? It's the number of protons. And so you just keep adding. The atomic number is the number of protons. And so as you can see here, there's 2 protons, and so therefore this must be helium. So as it turns out, when you look at this, if there's 2 protons, there's going to always be 2 electrons. The number of protons and electrons are even. They're equal in amounts. Most of the atoms are neutral in their native state. Now they can become positive or negative if they gain or lose electrons. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But as you can see, there's a lot of models of an atom, and this is a simple one, but it's fairly effective. So protons and neutrons are in the center nucleus, and the electrons are moving around very quickly, and the electrons are negatively charged. Now, another property of these particles is that they're really small. Like, look at this. Like, a proton and neutron are almost identical in mass, but 1.7 times 10 to the negative 24 gram. Okay, that's hard to imagine. And so we could sort of, an alternative, more appropriate perhaps unit is just saying that it's 1. Just call it 1. And you're like, all right, 1 what? 1 atomic mass unit. So a proton will be defined as 1 atomic mass unit. But then ATM, atomic mass unit, can be replaced by this term Dalton in honor of the great chemist John Dalton. So we say that a proton is about 1 Dalton, and so therefore a neutron is about 1 Dalton. Now electron is very, very tiny, so it's 1/2000th of a Dalton. Yeah. So we typically ignore its mass when we're considering the atomic mass of an atom. We typically ignore it because it's so insignificant, although it's present, because if it didn't have mass at all, it would no longer be matter. So that's important. So atomic number is the number of protons. That's how we define it. And so most of the atoms have no net charge. And so the atomic number, like for example, you're familiar with this, I'll just draw one of them like this. For example, carbon. This is the atomic number up here. It tells you the number of protons, and it also tells you the number of electrons. And these are equal, so carbon is neutral. That's how we roll with that. And so you just move along the periodic table this way. So atomic number is the number of protons, also the number of electrons. And so atomic mass, however, is the sum, the addition of protons and neutrons, because these are the ones that actually have mass. And so atomic number, the difference between atomic number and atomic weight is the measure of the mass. And so weight considers, if you recall this from your background in chemistry, it involves gravity. So in other words, if I have a certain weight on the planet Earth and I went to the moon to visit, my weight would be different, but my mass would be the same. However, for this course, we can sort of consider the fact that the mass and the weight are somewhat synonymous with one another. They're slightly different because of gravity. Okay, and so what's a little bit more interesting than that is the fact that some of these elements will have isotopes. Iso means the same. And so an element is kind of a mixture, if you will. Like carbon is a mixture of carbon 12, carbon 13, carbon 14. You're like, wait a minute, what is that? Well, all carbon has the same atomic number, which is 6 protons. Nothing in the universe has 6 protons but carbon. But apparently there can be different masses. And if there's different masses, that means there must be varying number of neutrons. And so different variations of carbons are called isotopes. And there's many elements that have isotopes. And you're like, what's the point of it? Well, some isotopes are useful in different disciplines. They can be used in chemistry, they can be used in biology, they can be used in medicine. And one of the things about it is that some of these isotopes are not very stable, meaning that they can decay and they emit particles. Now, that's a whole big discussion. They can emit electrons or beta particles, or they can release alpha particles, or helium nuclei. And basically when they decay, they can turn into a different element. And so they can, as a result, break down over a period of time. And you're like, well, gee, how fast is this? Well, in some instances, radioactive isotopes can break down rather quickly. In some examples, very, very, very slowly. So slowly that perhaps it's more realistic to consider how long does it take for half of it to break down. And it's sometimes called a half-life. And carbon is an example of that. Carbon-14 is radioactive, and so when half of it, so in other words, say I had 2 grams of carbon-14, it will eventually break down to nitrogen-14. And as a result of that, when half of it, so 1 gram remaining, when half of it breaks down, it takes 5,730 years. And so that can be kind of useful when you're dating things in the past. Like, for example, the study of paleontology, the study of fossils, you can sort of look at bones and scrape out some of the tissue. Now, why is that? Why is carbon isotopes useful? Because living things contain carbon. Like, for example, for us, we'll either eat carbon by eating an animal, or we'll eat a plant, and the plant ultimately gets it from the atmosphere. And so all living things have the same ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14 because it comes from the atmosphere. But as it turns out, if you're no longer breathing or eating, that means that the carbon-14 will begin to decay and the carbon-12 will remain the same. And so you can look at those ratios to determine the age of a fossil, so it's kind of useful. This is T-Rex. And so some shorter half-lives are useful when tracing medicines. Like you can see here in this PET scan, looking at what looks to be a pig here, you could use different radioactive isotopes and incorporate them into different compounds that you're maybe considering as medical treatments and pharmaceuticals. And so you can sort of look at this and see where they're going in the body, and it can be rather useful. Radioactive isotopes. In a separate video, I can talk about how one of the great examples, one of my favorite examples of how radioactive isotopes were used was one of the Nobel Prize winning scientists from the University of California, Berkeley, Melvin Calvin. He used radioactive 14 in carbon dioxide and he pumped that into this container of algae, and he was trying to determine how plants, although algae is not technically a plant, but how plants use carbon dioxide to produce glucose. And he knew it wasn't a one-step chemical reaction, that it was some kind of pathway. And so he used radioactive carbon 14, and he saw, through using X-rays, he saw compounds containing that material, and then he used different amounts of time as a measure of the pathway. And so he was able to determine that the pathway to producing glucose was cyclical, and he was able to determine the sequence of the reactions. Absolutely incredible. Nobel Prize. So one more thing that I want to say about an atom is that, there's a lot of analogies, but if the nucleus was a golf ball, like, where are the electrons? We mentioned they're flying around at the speed of light, 186,000 miles per second. Well, they would be about a kilometer away from that golf ball, so that's approximately a mile. So it's a lot of space, hard to even conceive. If you're following this, you must understand that we're mostly empty space as a result of that, because there's so many atoms that we have, and so it's kind of mind-blowing a little bit. So atoms are mostly empty space, but yet the nuclei therefore don't come very close to one another. It's the electrons that are the ones that are involved in interaction. And so our focus in the class is going to be on the subatomic particle of an electron, because those are the ones that are interacting. And so what can we say about an electron? Well, electrons are negatively charged. They have an incredibly small mass, and they're able to possess energy. And so what does this mean? Well, the definition of energy is the ability to do work. And so there's two types of energy. There's the energy of potential, which is the energy of position, or there's the energy of motion, which is kinetic energy. And so, like, for example, potential energy is if you put water up in a water tower. It has the potential to do work when it's released, or if you store it behind a dam, then you release it. It has the ability to move and produce electricity by pushing turbines and generating like a copper around a magnet and making electricity. So potential and kinetic energy. So these electrons, what happens is the further they are away from the nucleus, so like steps of a ladder, the more potential energy they have. Like it's a measure of distance. So the further the electrons are from the nucleus, the more potential energy they have. And so as it turns out, these electrons, though they're moving incredibly quickly, the distance from the nucleus for some electrons are discrete. And so they're in these fixed distances. And we sometimes refer to them as energy shells or electron shells. This might be familiar with your background in chemistry. So the very first shell has the least amount of potential energy, and if there's many shells in an atom, the ones that are furthest away have the most potential energy. It's kind of logical. And so you can see it here. Here's the nucleus. And so if I were to animate this and say, all right, here's an electron right there. And so if I were to take it up further, in other words, increase the potential energy, I would have to have energy to do that, like climbing up. And then when it falls back down, it releases. And so this is giving it potential energy, and this is releasing kinetic energy. And so potential energy, of course, equals kinetic energy. This is the first law of thermodynamics. And so, boy, it seems somewhat obvious or trivial. I mean, maybe in your inorganic chemistry class, you're familiar with the fact that you can take salts and put it under a Bunsen burner and heat it, which applies the energy, like in a flame test, and then when the electrons fall back down, they fluoresce in different colors, and you can use it to identify what some of the elements are in the salt. What's very cool is, at the most fundamental level, can't get into it right now, but I will later in a separate video, is that an atom of magnesium in the center of a chlorophyll molecule, which is a green pigment, sunlight comes down and strikes the electrons of chlorophyll and raises the electrons up, but instead of them just fluorescing and falling back down, those electrons are then shared by other molecules They're taken away, rather, in a redox reaction. Losing electrons is oxidation, and the compounds that are gaining it are become reduced. And ultimately, that's how photosynthetic organisms can take electrons away from chlorophyll, because the sunlight is pushing them up, and that's why glucose has energy. So it's a little abstract. I'll come back to it later. I don't want to leave you hanging, but it's cool. And so light has the power of doing this. And so if you're following this, you might have this question. Well, if magnesium keeps losing electrons to glucose, then what? It's going to run out. It would. Water replaces the electrons, and then in so doing, it becomes oxygen. So the truth is, water is the ultimate source of energy, not the sun. The sun's a catalyst. It's very important. Doesn't have to be, though. So chemical behavior of an atom is mostly determined by the electrons. Not only the electrons, but their configuration. That is a term that you probably are familiar with. In other words, their distribution, like of electrons within these shells. So as it turns out, since we're not going to consider all 92 naturally occurring elements, we always look at like sort of the first 18. These are the ones that are found in life. Remember, there's 25 elements in life approximately. So they're basically in the 8 columns, but the first 3 rows. And so we have 3 energy shells that we contend with in biology moving. And so when we look at this, let me just show you a picture of this. So this is our sort of biological periodic table. It's reduced. And so the first shell is the first energy shell. So these electrons are not very far. These were a little bit farther up and a little bit farther up still. Okay? So these energy shells are not the exact location of the electrons. They're just showing the distance. And so as it turns out, 2 of them can occupy the first shell, and 8 can occupy the second shell. And you can see here there's 1 electron in hydrogen, there's 2 over here, and there's 3 here, and there's 4 here. It corresponds to the atomic number. There's 6 electrons here in carbon. Where we're going to transition is, you might recall something called the Lewis dot structure. Like, for example, carbon, like you could sort of take a shortcut, and you're like, well, I know it has 6 protons. I know it has 6 electrons. And I know that 2 of them are in the first shell, and 4 are in the outer shell. But it's the outer shell electrons, or that configuration, that gives carbon its unique property. What I mean by that is how it associates with other elements in terms of chemical bonding. So we could say that carbon, if I were to draw carbon, I could just symbolize it with doing 4 dots like this. This would be the Lewis dot structure. And hydrogen would be this. And nitrogen would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'm just looking at outer electrons because those confer the property. And if you may recall, outer shell electrons are called valence electrons, or valence shell electrons. And so elements that have the same number of valence, in other words, nitrogen and phosphorus, behave similarly. Oxygen and sulfur behave similarly. So oxygen is more like sulfur than it is like nitrogen or fluorine. Fluorine is more like chlorine than it is like neon. Now, helium, neon, and argon are very unique because their outer shell electron is full, and so those don't actually participate at all in chemical bonding. They're inert, or if you will, if you recall this from chemistry, they're noble. So these gases are noble gases because they don't participate in chemical bonding because their valence shell electron is complete. And so all the other ones attempt to complete their valence shell electron by either losing electrons or gaining electrons. And so when you actually talk about the specific location of an electron, it gets to be rather philosophical and abstract and statistical in terms of like, well, they're moving around very quickly in a 3-dimensional space, and so it's really hard to get a grip on it. When we talk about shells, we talk about discrete distances from the nucleus. So we use this term orbital to define where we believe the electrons are most often found. And so, as it turns out, the first shell has room for 1 spherical orbital. So that's a circle or a ball, a small ball around the nucleus. The second shell can occupy a larger sphere. Sometimes it's called a 2s for sphere. And then it can also occupy 3 p orbitals, which are dumbbell shaped. And so this is what we have here. We have the first shell has a small s orbital or cloud, and then the 2s is a larger one, and then the p has 3. It has a x on the horizontal, y on the vertical, and z coming at you. So there's 3 p orbitals. And so what we say about this is that when electrons, they're all negatively charged. And so one thing for certain about an electron is they're moving really fast. There's a lot of uncertainty when it comes to electrons, don't worry. But one thing that we can be very certain is that, for example, let me take this s orbital and make it a little bit larger, like this. We could say that if one is moving in an up direction, the other one is moving in a downward direction, because they're avoiding each other separately. That's one thing that we could say for sure about electrons. So I hope you enjoyed this introduction to basic atomic properties and elements. Thanks for watching.